By the summer of 1715, more than a year had passed since the conclusion of the War of the Spanish Succession. With the war over, the maritime powers of Europe looked to their overseas trade fleets and merchantmen to refill their depleted treasuries. However, the war's end brought forth an unintended side effect. Hundreds of now unemployed sailors, who had fought as privateers for both sides in the war, now turned their talents for sailing and commerce raiding towards personal gain. Piracy became rampant on the high seas, especially in hotspots like the West Indies and Madagascar. These men, and even some women, sailed under the Black Flag, owing allegiance to no country or monarch, and making their fortunes by terrorizing the sea lanes in search of lucrative merchant ships to rob. In this video, we'll be exploring the Golden Age of Piracy, examining the fascinating lives and tales of infamous and notorious pirates of the post-Spanish Succession period, running from 1715 to around 1726, discussing how Woodes Rogers ended the Pirate Republic in Nassau, as well as Blackbeard's final battle, and how the heyday of high seas raiding came to a violent end.
This video is sponsored by you. Unfortunately, the YouTube environment is not great right now, with the algorithm being friendlier to drama and react channels and YouTube being permissive of AI slop. We don't do drama and we don't do AI, but thanks to our members and patrons, our channel continues to make 3 public videos per week, with the team intact and going strong. In recognition of their generosity and contributions, members and patrons receive 2 additional exclusive videos each week, and access many other perks. Join them to watch more than 250 exclusive videos covering every era of history. Join them by scanning the QR code on your screen, via the links in the description or pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video.
In the summer of 1701, the War of the Spanish Succession broke out in Europe as a great power contest to determine whether the throne of the Spanish Empire would remain Habsburg or transition to the House of Bourbon. In May 1702, England's new monarch, Queen Anne, issued a proclamation designed to boost Britain's depleted naval strength. The proclamation authorized the use of privateers to harass the merchant shipping and overseas commerce of France and Spain. Generally speaking, privateers were civilians, privately owned vessels that governments would commission in wartime by special letters of marque to attack and capture the shipping of enemy nations. Issuing letters of marque to privateers was seen as a much cheaper alternative to building up large and expensive war fleets. Theoretically, privateers could serve as auxiliaries to regular naval forces, but their chief role was restricted to commerce raiding. In the long course of the War of the Spanish Succession, British and American privateers were immensely successful, capturing more than 2,000 ships as prizes. In 1713, England exited the war through the Peace of Utrecht, which transformed Great Britain into the dominant maritime power of Europe. England was triumphant on land and sea. However, the war's end suddenly meant unemployment for large numbers of sailors who had served as privateers for the British Crown. The Royal Navy, bankrupted by 12 years of war, rapidly demobilized its fleet, mothballing warships and dumping nearly 3/4 of its manpower, over 36,000 men, in the first 24 months after the signing of the Peace of Utrecht. Privateering contracts suddenly became worthless. Privateer warships were tied up at docks, and their unemployed crews spilled out onto the wharves of England and the Americas, forced to beg for work while the merchant captains cut their crew wages by over 50%. Those sailors fortunate enough to find work on a merchant ship barely made ends meet, surviving on 22 to 28 shillings a month. Making matters worse, peace with Spain did not bring peace to English sailors finding work in the West Indies. Spanish Coast Guard vessels, known as the Guardas Costas, prowled the waters of the Caribbean, seizing English vessels passing to and from Jamaica and declaring that they were smugglers if so much as a single Spanish coin was found on board. However, they always found illicit coins, since the Spanish dollar was the de facto currency in all of England's Caribbean colonies. In the first 2 years of peace, 38 Jamaican trading vessels were seized, costing the owners nearly £76,000 in losses. When the crews resisted, the Guardas Costas often killed a few sailors in retribution, while the rest would spend months or even years in Cuban prisons. In summary, the Caribbean had become even more dangerous in peacetime than in war. Impoverished mariners crowded the streets, taverns, and boarding houses of Port Royal, Jamaica, angry at their treatment by the Spanish Guardas Costas and frustrated by inaction from their own British government. Losses to the Spanish meant English merchantmen sent out fewer vessels from Port Royal, and as a consequence, there was an acute lack of job opportunities for unemployed sailors. English mariners captured by the Spanish, some more than once, were tortured and abused by their captors as their finances were pinched by their employers, who made up for shipping losses by simply not paying their sailors during time spent in Spanish prisons. Fed up with Spanish abuse and British neglect, large numbers of sailors and ex-privateers now turned to piracy. The war had inadvertently trained thousands of new pirate recruits. One of the very first to turn pirate was Benjamin Hornigold, and he took with him Edward Teach, or Thatch. Both had served together aboard Jamaican privateers during the war and had become unemployed with the peace. By the summer of 1713, both were fed up with poverty in Port Royal and angry at the Spanish Guardas Costas. Hornigold convinced Teach and a number of former shipmates and drinking buddies to put their privateering skills to good use and solve both problems. They would go back to attacking the Spanish, while simultaneously enriching themselves. All that was needed was a small ship, a few good men, and a secure base from which to operate. Hornigold knew just the place, and it was right there in the Caribbean, the Bahamas. During the war, there had been fierce fighting in and around the sparsely inhabited islands of the Bahamas, most of it centered around the one island with the most commercial importance, New Providence. In 1703, a Franco-Spanish expedition had virtually destroyed the island's only major settlement, chief harbour, and seat of government for the Bahamas, Nassau. In the year after the sack of Nassau, the governor of the Bahamas abdicated, and in the following years many of the town's inhabitants gave up and fled to the mainland. As the population steadily declined, no effort was made to re-establish a colonial government in Nassau. Then, in 1713, the pirates moved in. When Hornigold and his party stepped onto the beach at Nassau, they found not a town, but a collection of partially collapsed buildings, overgrown with scrub and tropical vegetation, gathered around the burned-out shells of a church and a fort. On the whole island, there were probably less than 30 families living in hovels and rudimentary houses, barely eking out a living through fishing, tree cutting, or salvaging the remains of ships wrecked on the island's treacherous shores. Hornigold knew that he'd made the right choice. The men organized themselves into 3 bands, building 3 large wooden boats capable of carrying 30 men. Over the next 6 months, Hornigold and his band of pirates attacked small Spanish trading vessels and isolated sugar plantations from the Straits of Florida to the shores of Cuba. Hornigold's crew returned to Nassau laden with expensive Silesian linens, Asian silks, silver coins stolen from Spanish vessels, and rum. Together, Hornigold's crew brought cargoes worth £13,175 into the ruins of Nassau. Other former privateers who turned to piracy soon followed in Ben Hornigold's wake. The island was at the center of heavily traded sea lanes between the Spanish possessions to the west, the North American coast only a short sailing trip to the north, and the European trade routes between France and England and their rich sugar colonies in the West Indies. By 1715, more than 2,000 ex-privateers had invaded New Providence in the wake of Captain Hornigold. They referred to their anarchic state as the Republic of Pirates. By the following year, 1716, the pirates based in Nassau and New Providence Island had become a menace to the mercantile shipping from the coast of Maine to the Spanish Main. But even this was only the beginning of a revived pirate war on the civilized world. On July 24th, 1715, the annual Spanish treasure fleet departed Havana, bound for Cadiz, Spain, heavily laden down with a vast cargo of jewels, gold, and silver, valued at around 14 million pesos. A week later, the fleet became caught in a vicious hurricane, and all 11 treasure galleons were wrecked on the eastern shore of Florida. Spanish vessels from Havana were dispatched to salvage the wrecks, working with diving equipment to recover the sunken treasure. The Spaniards recovered several million pieces of eight, most of which they transported to the fortress in Havana. But some 350,000 pieces of eight still awaited transport, and this silver was being held in a guardhouse on shore under the watchful eyes of 60 armed men. Unbeknownst to the Spanish, several ex-privateers in Jamaica, including Henry Jennings, Benjamin Hornigold, Edward Teach, Charles Vane, and Samuel Bellamy, had learned of the salvaging operation, and they set sail in 5 ships for the coast of Florida. The small flotilla of around 300 men attacked the Spanish guards and then seized the waiting treasure, carrying it off towards Jamaica. However, upon reaching Jamaica, the pirates were shocked to discover they were not welcomed with open arms. The Spanish had complained to the governor of Jamaica, Lord Archibald Hamilton, pointing out that there was a peace treaty in force and they demanded the return of the silver. Since the war was now long over, Lord Hamilton let the ex-privateers know that they would not go unpunished. And so, the pirates set sail for Nassau and established it as their main base. Most Nassau pirates concentrated their raiding on the trade between Britain and her American colonies. One particular effect of the pirate presence in the Caribbean, often complained of by planters and merchants, was the unrest spread among the African slaves who worked in the cane fields of the Sugar Islands. These enslaved peoples, hearing rumors that they would be welcomed in the Pirate Republic, ran away from their plantations in ever-increasing numbers, bent on becoming pirates. Inevitably, as the Pirate Republic on Nassau flourished, powerful personalities and dominant figures arose from the ranks of the brigands who flocked to the free life on the island. Among the most notorious of Nassau was Edward Teach, soon to become immortalized by his terrifying nickname, Blackbeard, and who would be wanted by the authorities from Honduras to Nova Scotia. Bloody and cruel, Blackbeard was a terror not only to his victims, but even to fellow pirates who consorted with him in the taverns and brothels. On November 28, 1717, Blackbeard and his crew captured a 200-ton French slave ship off the island of Martinique, which was renamed Queen Anne's Revenge. Blackbeard terrorized the West Indies during his raiding spree aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge. Other pirate captains were also fearsome figures. Charles Vane specialized in preying on shipping bound for North American ports. Vane would often sail with other pirate captains in a flotilla, regarding this as the most effective means of ensuring numerical superiority when attacking their prey. Vane never allowed his lust for women, rage, or drink to cloud his vision, and he enjoyed years of success as a Nassau captain because he knew when to fight and when to run. Perhaps one of the most successful pirates of the post-Spanish succession period was Samuel Black Sam Bellamy, who is believed to have plundered over $130 million in loot. Well-mannered, Sam Bellamy dressed flashy like other pirates, and was known for carrying 4 dueling pistols in his sash. Like many of the other pirate ships of the day, Black Sam's crew was considered very democratic, organizing votes to elect men into vital crew roles. Bellamy usually pirated with 2 ships, one heavily armed and the other smaller and more maneuverable to block ships and easily capture them. His balanced and coordinated attacks meant he took many ships with their cargoes fully intact. After participating in the pirate raid on the 1715 Treasure Fleet salvage operation, Sam Bellamy partnered with Ben Hornigold and Edward Teach aboard the ship Marianne. However, by the summer of 1716, Hornigold's crew had become annoyed that their captain refused to attack ships flying English colours, and voted to depose both him and Teach from command. Sam Bellamy was then elected captain of the remaining 90 crewmen. After captaining the Marianne for a while, Bellamy came upon the ship Sultana, capturing her and converting her into a 26-gun galley, which he took command of as his flagship. In late February 1717, Bellamy attacked the 300-ton, 18-gun slave ship Whydah galley as she passed through the Windward Passage between Cuba and Hispaniola. She had just completed the second leg of the Middle Passage in the Columbian Exchange, dropping off 500 slaves in the Caribbean and picking up boatloads of gold, treasure, and fine goods to return to England with. After a fierce 3-day chase, the Whydah's captain, Lawrence Prince, surrendered the ship without a struggle. After capturing the ship, Bellamy stayed true to his reputation as the Robin Hood of the seas and traded the Sultana to Captain Prince for the Whydah galley, which he made his new flagship. Captain Bellamy and his crew then spent the next several months pirating off the coast of the British North American colonies. Another ex-privateer who journeyed to Nassau and later became a notorious pirate captain was Calico Jack Rackham. A brash figure fond of splashy waistcoats, bright ribbons and colourful breeches, Jack Rackham was initially elected quartermaster of Vane's ship, the Ranger. But his real fame and reputation came later, when he met and wooed a flamboyantly beautiful Irish woman named Anne Bonny, whom he took pirating with him. Anne Bonny came to Nassau in 1715 or 1716 as the wife of a poor young sailor. Although only 16 at the time, she yearned for the adventure of life at sea, and despite her married state, she often sought out the company of pirates like Vane, Blackbeard or Hornigold, drinking with them and soaking up their way of life. When she met and eventually fell in love with the swaggering Jack Rackham, she fought by his side as fiercely as any male pirate. Not all pirates were competent. There was, for example, the case of the gentleman pirate, Stede Bonnet, who turned to piracy to escape his unhappy marriage life. As a member of a good English family and the owner of a successful sugar plantation in Barbados, Bonnet was regarded as a gentleman by his peers on the island until he suddenly announced his intention to become a pirate. Bonnet soon christened his sugar trading ship as the Revenge, and then went out to join the pirates of Nassau. He would eventually fall in with the crew of Blackbeard. Although popular culture from the past 3 centuries has depicted the pirate's life as a swashbuckling adventure, the reality was far from the truth. Life aboard pirate ships during the Golden Age was crowded and dirty. Pirate crews were much larger than those of merchant ships, and men were crowded closely together aboard their ship. Add to this the intense heat of the tropical West Indies, the liberal use of alcohol, and the touchy pride of men who jealously defended the equality they gained by joining the democracy of pirates, and it's clear to see that maintaining discipline aboard these rowdy ships was no easy task. Pirate society was governed by the articles the crewmen and officers signed on joining, which were an attempt to impose a legal system all could agree on. One common pirate article required every man keep his weapons clean and ready for use at any given moment. Gambling was usually banned on board the ships, and drinking was usually restricted to the top deck to prevent fires breaking out in holds. Contrary to the popular culture's depiction of ruthless, tyrannical pirate captains lording over their crews, the majority of pirate crews were highly democratic and organized shipboard elections to choose the most able or popular sailors to important leadership and officer roles such as captain and quartermaster. These elected officers could just as easily be deposed by the crew they commanded. The makeup of pirate crews was diverse, with men hailing from all backgrounds and races. Among the pirate crew's ranks were escaped slaves, men disgraced or scorned by civilized society, penniless ex-privateers, and impoverished sailors, with some even possessing former military experience. Pirate crews needed frequent replenishing. Most men sailing under the black flag were volunteers, but casualties from disease, combat, accidents, and occasional desertions took their toll. Since able seamen, maritime carpenters, coopers, and navigators were preferred, pirates sought recruits from among the crews of the ships they captured. Pirates did not like risking injuries to themselves or damage to their prizes, so when ships ran or fought, their captains were usually punished severely. The pirates would then try to persuade the rest of the men to enlist in their crews. The pirate captain or quartermaster might make valid arguments to their captives regarding the merchantman's poor treatment and underfunding by their captains, which usually persuaded many to join their ranks. The actual capturing of prizes by pirate ships has also been embellished by popular culture. Pirates seldom surprise their prey. Rather, they boldly announce their arrival with a shot across the enemy ship's bow and displaying the black flag. As they closed with their victims, pirates usually appeared on deck drunk and heavily armed. Alcohol would temporarily boost the pirates' courage and dull the pain of wounds. Frequently, they would dance about the deck to music provided by the ship's musicians, waving their weapons, shouting war cries and growling, and often shouting insults at their prey. Though most pirates had fearsome reputations as eager fighters, they really had little to gain and much to lose from combat. The pirates' intimidating appearance was usually enough to frighten their prey into surrendering before a fight ever broke out. If the target tried to run, however, the pirates would give chase, attempting to disable her before closing in for the kill. If the enemy crew resisted further, the pirates would then jump onto their enemy's decks and engage in bloody close-quarters boarding action. By the end of 1717, the Nassau pirates had so savaged Caribbean shipping that the British government was beginning to take notice of their sharp drop in commerce. It was one thing for the pirates to be raiding commercial shipping of the Spanish or the French, but when these rascalous pirates of the Nassau began severely hurting British trade, the government of King George I took notice. As the situation in the Caribbean worsened, and it became apparent that the Royal Navy would not or could not suppress the Nassau pirates, a syndicate of British merchants joined together to deal with the problem. Soon enough, this consortium had formulated a bold plan to restore order to Nassau and defeat the pirates of the Caribbean. The first significant blow to the pirates of the post-Spanish succession period was the death of one of their most successful captains, Samuel Black Sam Bellamy. At midnight on April the 26th, 1717, Bellamy's ship, the Whydah galley, became caught in a violent nor'easter cyclone off Cape Cod. Crewmen struggled to follow Bellamy's orders as waves crashed on deck, but they managed to turn the ship's bow into the wind and drop anchor. Yet, when the anchors started to drag, everyone realized the Whydah was doomed. Bellamy ordered the anchors cut and for the helmsman to steer closer to shore so that the crew might be saved. At first, it seemed like the ship would reach the nearby beach, but then the horrified crew watched as they slipped stern first over 30-foot waves. The Whydah forcefully ran aground at the foot of the cliffs, throwing men off the rigging into the churning waves, while cannon broke loose from their tackles and crushed everyone in their path. The turbulent storm brought down the ship's main mast, and waves spilled over the deck and poured onto the decks below. At dawn, the Whydah galley's hull finally broke apart. The storm raged on through the morning, casting mangled bodies onto the shore. Samuel Bellamy and 160 of his crew had all perished in the storm. The greatest blow dealt to the pirates of Nassau came in December 1717, when word reached New Providence that King George I had issued a proclamation in September, decreeing that any pirate who surrendered to the British within the year would receive a full pardon for all crimes committed before January 5th, 1718. These pardons had been conceived by Woodes Rogers, an English sea captain who had served as a privateer in the War of the Spanish Succession, and had now been appointed the new governor of the Bahamas. With news of the royal pardon, Nassau's pirates broke down into two factions. Many of the moderate pirates, mostly former privateers like Henry Jennings and Benjamin Hornigold, welcomed the pardon as an opportunity to regain their legitimacy and invest their loot in commercial trade. The other faction, led by Charles Vane, were embittered and angry men who saw themselves not as businessmen but as thieves and outlaws, rebelling against a society ruled by wealthy elites who cared only for themselves. Consequently, they rejected the pardon categorically. Until this point, Vane had largely remained outside of the power structure in Nassau. Now, he led an angry mob of pirates to Fort Nassau, cut down the Union Jack raised by Jennings' followers, and hoisted a black flag in its place. The situation in Nassau remained tense throughout January 1718, and the pirates gathered in a general council to resolve their differences. Vane and his supporters argued they should fortify the island and force King George to negotiate with them. At the same time, Jennings and Hornigold insisted they should take the pardon and surrender without resistance when the new royal governor arrived. The arguments became heated, and the council broke up without reaching a consensus. With that, many pirates began to pack up and leave Nassau. On the evening of July 24th, Woodes Rogers' ship dropped anchor in the harbour of Nassau, accompanied by a small flotilla of warships and transports, commanded by Commodore Peter Chamberlain, aboard the 36-gun frigate HMS Milford. By now, Charles Vane and his crew had already been planning to leave Nassau, but the harbour exit was now guarded by 2 warships of Rogers' flotilla, the 20-gun frigate HMS Rose and the 10-gun sloop of war Shark. Unable to escape, Vane decided upon a bold strategy. At 2 a.m., Vane's ship weighed anchor and headed towards the flotilla. All the guns had been unloaded. One pirate remained at the helm to steer the ship straight at the Rose and the Shark, while other pirates set the rigging and pitch-soaked decks alight. The pirates abandoned the ship as it ploughed through the water towards the naval vessels. Before the fireship could collide with them, the frenzied British crews worked to cut their anchors and sail to open sea. The warships just narrowly got underway and escaped the blazing inferno. Vane watched all this transpire from the deck of his swift sloop, the Catherine. Although he was disappointed his fireship had not damaged the warships, it bought Vane time to make final preparations to run Rogers' blockade. At 7 a.m., just as the entirety of Rogers' flotilla appeared at the harbour entrance, Vane weighed anchor and set sail. The Catherine sped through the narrow eastern harbour entrance, pursued by the sloop of war Buck. Although his pursuers were gaining on him, the Catherine finally rounded the eastern end of New Providence, and the crew loosed all sails into the wind. As Vane's men fired shots at the Buck, the British were finally forced to call off the chase. Charles Vane had escaped and would remain at large, but Woodes Rogers now had Nassau. On July 26th, Rogers landed ashore and was joyously received by the pro-pardon pirates. Benjamin Hornigold led Rogers through the crumbling Fort Nassau, where the new governor addressed the gathered crowd of 300 people by reading aloud the King's commission appointing him governor of the Bahamas. Over the next few days, Rogers oversaw the consolidation of his control over New Providence, and his 100-man independent company of British troops took control of Fort Nassau. In a makeshift office, he consulted with prominent residents to serve on his 12-man governing council. Rogers knew that Vane was still at large, and Spain still posed a threat. Consequently, Fort Nassau had to be repaired and refurbished, but labour shortages delayed this work. An unidentified disease had spread amongst the Nassau population, severely affecting the soldiers, sailors, and colonists Rogers had brought with him to the island. Long-time residents of the island had developed a strong resistance to such diseases, but the newcomers were unaccustomed to tropical climate and were highly susceptible. Rogers himself became ill, and by mid-August was unable to attend meetings. The disease also killed off much of the cattle on New Providence, depleting the people's food supply. As if that wasn't bad enough, long-time Nassau residents resisted Rogers' efforts to put them to work. Around this time, Commodore Chamberlain announced that his 3 warships were leaving. War was looming with Spain again, and they were needed elsewhere. Rogers insisted they stay, as the island was still vulnerable with the current state of its fortifications. Chamberlain, however, asserted that his ships had no orders to remain. Since Rogers had no authority over the Royal Navy Commodore, he had no choice but to beg. Chamberlain finally agreed to leave behind the 20-gun Rose for another 3 weeks, while Rogers worked on the fortifications, after which they too would depart. At 9:30 a.m. on August 16th, the Milford and Shark departed Nassau for New York. Things only grew worse for Governor Rogers after that. Heavy thunderstorms hit the island for 2 weeks, while Rogers' lieutenants tried their best to get the lazy ex-pirates to fix up the fort. More bad news came when it was discovered that the Spanish Guardas Costas vessels had been sailing around New Providence, gathering intelligence on the island and Nassau for an imminent invasion, for Great Britain had renewed conflict with Spain in the War of the Quadruple Alliance. Now, on top of reorganizing New Providence into a productive British colony, Governor Rogers would have to defend it from the Spanish. While Woodes Rogers busied himself with restoring order in Nassau, another prominent pirate captain was still at large, and that pirate was none other than Blackbeard. After learning of the royal proclamation, Blackbeard came to realize that the pirates' reign over the high seas was nearing its end. Although he respected Charles Vane's determination to fight on to the end as a pirate, Blackbeard had no intention of going out in a blaze of glory. He wished to get away from the pirate's life and lie low in order to eventually settle down somewhere with his riches. But Blackbeard decided that in order to set himself up with enough wealth to settle down for good, he needed to pull off one more big score. Perhaps at the suggestion of the gentleman pirate Stede Bonnet, Blackbeard decided to blockade Charleston, South Carolina. On May 22, 1718, Blackbeard's fleet arrived off the Charleston bar, 9 miles south of the colony, seizing the pilot boat before they could raise the alarm. They then waited at the approaches to fall upon unsuspecting ships. Within days, at least 5 ships had been captured and looted. One ship they captured was transporting prominent passengers to London, among whom several were distinguished citizens of Charleston. Blackbeard decided to hold these people captive to demand a ransom for a chest of medical supplies containing medicine that could treat an outbreak of syphilis among the crew. Governor Robert Johnson immediately agreed to the demand. The chest of medicines was delivered to Blackbeard, along with a message from Governor Johnson offering to pardon Blackbeard if he laid down his arms. Though Blackbeard rejected the offer, he kept good to his ransom, releasing the captives and their plundered vessels. After this, Blackbeard's ships left Charleston, and 6 days later they turned into Topsail Inlet, halfway up North Carolina's swampy coast. While navigating the inlet's uncharted shoals, the Queen Anne's Revenge ran into the sandy shoals. As Blackbeard's ship began listing to port and took on water, efforts to try and drag the Queen Anne's Revenge off the shoal failed, dooming her. With the ship lost, the pirates all transferred to Bonnet's former ship, the Revenge, then sailed up to Beaufort. To everyone's surprise, Blackbeard announced he would give command of the ship back to Bonnet, and the gentleman pirate took a shallow boat to shore towards Beaufort to receive a pardon at once, promising to return for the rest of the men shortly after. Just after Bonnet left, Blackbeard's crew took Bonnet's shipmates captive, stranding 16 of them on a sandy, uninhabited island off the mainland. Another 200 of the pirates were abandoned in Beaufort, as Blackbeard and his shipmates took one of the Spanish sloops they had captured and sailed away. Leaving Bonnet behind at Beaufort, Blackbeard and his men sailed up to Bath, the capital of the North Carolina colony, where he surrendered to Governor Charles Eden, bribing him into receiving a pardon. Over the summer, Blackbeard spent much of his time between Bath and his favorite anchorage, Ocracoke Inlet on the Outer Banks. He even met with Charles Vane at Ocracoke after the latter escaped from Nassau in July. With Governor Eden in his pocket, Blackbeard had practically turned North Carolina into a pirate lair for himself. In the meantime, Stede Bonnet and his crew were captured at the mouth of Cape Fear River on September 27th, and all but 4 were convicted of piracy and hanged in Charleston, bringing an ignominious end to the career of the so-called gentleman pirate. It would be the governor of Virginia, Alexander Spottswood, who would commence the final hunt for Blackbeard. Spottswood had kept track of Blackbeard's pirating activities for months. In early October 1718, he met with Royal Navy captains Ellis Brand and George Gordon, requesting their assistance in hunting the notorious pirate down. Spottswood's plan called for a 2-pronged assault on Blackbeard's main hideaways at Bath and Ocracoke Island, with Brand leading a contingent of Marines overland to Bath, while the second force blockaded Ocracoke. For the expedition, Spottswood provided the captains with 2 sloops at his own expense. The ships would be placed under the command of Gordon's first officer, Lieutenant Robert Maynard. Spottswood's plan was entirely illegal, as no colonial or military officials had the authority to invade another British colony. Nevertheless, the governor's expedition departed Hampton on November 17th, with Maynard commanding aboard the larger sloop Jane. The other sloop, Ranger, was captained by Midshipman Edmund Hyde of the HMS Line. At 3 p.m., the ships sailed out of Hampton Roads. Just hours after Maynard weighed anchor, Captain Brand and a small contingent of sailors left Hampton Village, traveling down the Virginia countryside and into North Carolina. 6 days later, Brand's men reached the outskirts of Bath at about 10 p.m. on November 23rd. Scouts reported that Blackbeard was not in town, so Brand went straight to the plantation house of Governor Eden, where he stated his purpose in hunting down and capturing Blackbeard. Elsewhere, though, events had already transpired that brought the hunt to a close. At 4 p.m. on November 21st, 2 days before Brand arrived at Bath, Lieutenant Maynard's 2 ships reached Ocracoke Island and spotted 2 sloops behind the island. One was armed with 9 guns and matched the description of Blackbeard's ship Adventure. With the sun already setting, Maynard decided against a night assault and instead prepared for an attack the next day, as Blackbeard's crew partied and drank the night away beside bonfires on shore. At 9 a.m. on November 22nd, Maynard sailed his sloops straight towards the Adventure to try and board her while she was still uncrewed. Midshipman Hyde's Ranger ran aground on a sandbar as they approached. Still, Maynard continued with the larger Jane until he too ran aground, eliminating all chances of a surprise attack. When Blackbeard's crew realized they were being attacked, they rushed to the Adventure and hurriedly set off. Hyde finally got the Ranger free and sped towards Blackbeard's ship, but when the Ranger came within close range, Blackbeard's guns unleashed a broadside. The Ranger was hit across the foredeck, killing Hyde and his second-in-command. Wounded men littered the blood-stained deck, and some sailors fired their muskets at the Adventure as she sailed past them. One lucky musket shot hit the line holding the Adventure's foresails, and the ship began to lose speed. Just then, Maynard's crew got the Jane afloat and rowed towards the Adventure to try to board her. The 2 ships closed to within 50 yards when Blackbeard's gunners opened another broadside with deadly grape shot, killing or wounding 21 crewmen on the Jane. Blackbeard believed the battle was over and that he had won. He pulled the Adventure alongside the sloop to board her. However, Maynard had ordered the uninjured men to hide in the Jane's hold, and they now awaited the lieutenant's signal. Blackbeard was the first of his crew to board the sloop. At the signal, Maynard rushed from the hold armed with his sword in hand, accompanied by a dozen other sailors. Blackbeard and Maynard faced one another in a dramatic sword duel. Maynard thrust his blade against Blackbeard's cartridge box, bending it to the hilt. Then Blackbeard shattered the guard of his enemy's sword and sliced his fingers with a single swift blow. Maynard jumped back and fired his pistol, wounding his opponent. By now, more of Blackbeard's men were jumping aboard and engaged in a vicious brawl with Maynard's crew. The Jane's helmsman, Abraham Demelt, assisted Maynard and slashed Blackbeard across the face. The pirates were outnumbered, and many soon fell dead onto the bloody deck. Several more sailors fired at Blackbeard with their pistols, but amazingly, Blackbeard kept swinging at Maynard as blood spilled across his body and face. More shots tore through Blackbeard, then all the sailors surrounded him with their swords drawn. According to one account, a Scots Highlander in Maynard's crew finally delivered a heavy sword swing that severed Blackbeard's head. He had already received 5 gunshot wounds and 20 sword cuts across his body. The whole ordeal ended in just 6 minutes, and all of Blackbeard's pirates were killed. Blackbeard, the most fearsome pirate of his day and the terror of the seas for over a year, was dead. His head was strung up on the Adventure's bowsprit, and after Maynard returned to Virginia, it was stuck on a pole at the entrance to Hampton Roads for all to see. The death of Blackbeard dealt a fatal blow to the Golden Age of Piracy. Back in the Bahamas, Woodes Rogers worked tirelessly to restore civilization to Nassau and led the colony's defense against a Spanish attack in 1720. However, Rogers lacked support from home in England, and upon his return to London in March 1721, he discovered that a new governor had been appointed, and he was sent to debtor's prison. Even so, Woodes Rogers' thankless efforts in governing Nassau had worked, and by 1722, order had been restored to the island. With Charles Vane's capture and execution by the British in 1721, and Jack Rackham following him a year later, most of the notorious pirates that had been the scourge of the West Indies were gone. Although some pirates still prowled the Caribbean, by 1726 they were no longer the menace they had been the decade before, marking the end of the Golden Age of Piracy. The post-Spanish succession period pirates, despite their notorious criminality, had caught the attention and interest of the general public. With the publication, in 1724, of the book A General History of the Pirates, the feared pirates of Nassau in the West Indies gained a legendary, almost mythical status in popular culture. Centuries later, the pirates of the Caribbean continue to captivate people's imaginations, remaining a strong part of popular culture. One of the contributing factors to the Golden Age of Piracy's decline were the increasing number of pirate hunters. With Commodore Peter Chamberlain's Royal Navy flotilla having already departed for New York due to the imminent war with Spain, and the need for the island's populace in the building of defences, Governor Woodes Rogers looked to Nassau's newly pardoned pirates for the task of capturing fugitive rogues such as Charles Vane. Benjamin Hornigold and John Cockram were up to the task and agreed to become pirate hunters. Hornigold and Cockram set sail in a sloop for Green Turtle Key near Abaco to observe Charles Vane's hideout and, if possible, capture him. But they deemed Vane's company too strong for a direct assault. They did, however, capture the brigantine Wolf and her captain, a pardoned pirate named Nicholas Woodall, who was smuggling provisions into Vane's camp. Hornigold's actions impressed Rogers upon his return, and he was further pleased when in December 1718, Hornigold captured another relapsed pirate captain, John Auger. Ben Hornigold, John Cockram, and another ex-pirate, Hosea Burgess, spent the next year serving as loyal pirate hunters for Woodes Rogers, sailing around the Bahamas in search of their former comrades to bring them to justice. Two conflicting accounts exist regarding Hornigold's ultimate fate during the spring of 1719. The first claims that while privateering against Spanish shipping off Havana, he was attacked and captured by a Spanish frigate and brig, and either died in the action or rotted away in a Cuban prison. The other, more common account states that while chasing a pirate across the West Indies, Hornigold's ship became caught in a hurricane and wrecked on an uncharted reef between the Bahamas and Mexico, and he was among the crew killed in the incident. To this day, however, the wreck of Benjamin Hornigold's ship has not been found. Nevertheless, the man who had greatly helped with both creating and destroying Nassau's pirate republic was never seen again. Hosea Burgess shared a similar fate that year when his ship was wrecked off Abaco and he drowned. After the fall of the Nassau Republic, Charles Vane and his pirates departed Green Turtle Key in late September 1718, sailing north in search of the only man he knew could help him reclaim the pirate republic from Rogers, Blackbeard. In the second week of October, Vane arrived at Ocracoke Island, where his pirates and Blackbeard's crew held festivities over several days. Though Vane attempted to convince his friend to join him, Blackbeard was comfortable with his new life of supposed retirement and declined. The two crews then concluded the festivities before going their separate ways. It was the last time Vane would see Blackbeard, who was killed 8 weeks later. Vane now proposed to the ship's company, including his quartermaster, John Calico Jack Rackham, and his first mate, Robert Deal, that they sack a small farming hamlet on the island of Eleuthera, loot all the supplies they could, then head to Hispaniola to establish a hideout. The crew agreed, and in late October, they easily sacked and plundered Eleuthera. Weeks later, while sailing through the Windward Passage on November 23rd, Vane's lookout spotted a distant ship, and he ordered a pursuit. The crew hoisted the black flag and expected their victim to surrender. Instead, the ship ran up the French Navy ensign, opened her gun ports, which had gone unnoticed, and fired a broadside. Outgunned, Vane ordered to sail off into the wind, but the frigate gave chase. The pirates quarreled over how to proceed. Though Vane wished to escape, Rackham and most of the crew urged him to attack and board the frigate. Vane argued that their foe had 24 guns, twice their own number, and that they might be sunk before they could board. Although Deal and 15 others agreed with his decision, the remaining 75 sided with Rackham, forcing Vane to assert his captain's authority to keep them in line. The disgruntled crew followed orders angrily and escaped their pursuers. The next day, with the danger now behind them, Rackham called a meeting with the ship's company, and they gave Vane a vote of no confidence, deposing him. Jack Rackham was elected captain, and Vane was put aboard his secondary sloop while Rackham sailed off with their brig for Jamaica. Vane set sail in his tiny sloop for the Bay Islands, 40 miles off Honduras. A few days into the voyage, a hurricane caused his sloop to run aground on a small, uninhabited island in the Bay of Honduras. For weeks, Vane lived as a castaway. Sometime in early 1719, an English trader anchored off the island and Vane requested passage, as their captain was a retired privateering friend named Holford. Knowing Vane's reputation, Holford refused and left him there. But soon another ship arrived and took the castaway aboard without knowing his identity. He provided a false name and signed on for the remaining voyage. Unfortunately for Vane, Holford returned and was invited to dine with the captain of Vane's ship. Holford spotted Vane while glancing down the hold and informed the captain of his true identity. Vane was then held at gunpoint and clapped into irons. Within 2 weeks, he was back in Jamaica, where he rotted in prison for a year. On March 22, 1721, Charles Vane stood trial in Spanish Town. Governor Nicholas Laws sentenced him to be hanged, and his execution was carried out at Gallows Point in Port Royal on March 29, 1721. After usurping Vane, Calico Jack Rackham spent the next few months pirating across the West Indies. In mid-May of 1719, he returned to Nassau and convinced Governor Rogers to issue pardons for his crew. The crew then spent their stolen money before gradually dispersing. While drinking in Nassau's tavern, Rackham met the fiery Anne Bonny, wife of ex-pirate James Bonny, now an informant for Rogers. Anne and Jack soon fell in love, and in the spring of 1720, Rackham asked James to annul his marriage in exchange for a large payment. To complete the annulment, though, a witness was required, but the man they chose informed Rogers of their plan. The highly religious governor was appalled and told James if he annulled the marriage, Anne would be thrown in prison and Jack would be forced to whip her. Unable to continue their relationship ashore, Rackham and Anne decided to leave Nassau and become pirates. They gathered 6 restless ex-pirates, as well as one of Anne's close friends, a cross-dressing female sailor named Mary Read. And on the night of August 22, 1720, they stole a swift 6-gun sloop, the William. Jack Rackham, Anne Bonny, and Mary Read spent the next several months raiding merchant ships while hopping from harbour to harbour in Jamaica, recruiting additional sailors. Although uncertain, as no contemporary records definitively link the design to him, Jack Rackham is often credited with inventing the famous Jolly Roger black flag, with crossed swords that has become synonymous with pirates. During Rackham's pirating spree around Jamaica, Anne Bonny and Mary Read became inseparable, and the two women likely maintained a polyamorous relationship with Calico Jack. Unfortunately for all three, Rackham's reckless pirating strategy eventually caught up with them. While Jack was gathering recruits in western Jamaica on October 22, 1720, a ship spotted the William and reported its whereabouts to a privateer captain named Jonathan Barnett. While Captain Barnett chased after the William, Rackham's crew spent the whole day and night drinking, affecting their ability to handle the ship. At 10 p.m, Barnett's sloop hailed the pirates and demanded they strike their colours, to which one of the drunken pirates responded, "We will strike no strikes." Barnett fired a broadside, dismasting the William as Rackham and his drunken crewmates retreated into the hold, leaving just Anne and Mary on deck. Barnett's men soon boarded, and Rackham's crew were taken into custody. Jack, Anne, and Mary were promptly tossed into prison in Spanish Town to await trial. Rackham was first to be tried and found guilty. On November 18, 1720, Calico Jack Rackham was executed at Gallows Point in Port Royal, and his body was displayed in a gibbet on a small island in the harbour. Mary Read and Anne Bonny were tried on November 28 and sentenced to execution. But, to the surprise of Governor Laws, the women shouted that they were pregnant. After an examination proved their claims, the women became ineligible for execution, for it was illegal for the court to take the lives of their unborn children. With their death sentences postponed, Anne and Mary returned to prison. Mary Read eventually fell ill with a fever and died in prison sometime in April 1721. As for Anne, her fate remains unknown, though she was not executed. Her long-estranged father, a well-off South Carolina planter, may have obtained her release, but from this point on, Anne Bonny simply disappears from the records. By 1722, the once pirate-infested waters of the West Indies gradually became safe once more. As the maritime powers increased their naval presence in the region, the hunters now became the hunted. Many pirates left the Caribbean for the coast of West Africa or Madagascar, where they could prey on poorly defended slave ships. Perhaps no pirate was more successful in these later years than Bartholomew Roberts. Born in Wales as John Roberts on May 17, 1682, the soon-to-be infamous pirate known as Black Bart left home early to join the Royal Navy, serving in the War of Spanish Succession. Afterwards, he signed on as a mate aboard a Barbados merchant sloop. Roberts earned a well-deserved reputation as a master sailor by his mid-30s. But despite his ambitions of becoming captain of his own ship, since he was a Welshman of low-born status, Roberts was unable to rise far in the officer ranks. It was while serving as a third mate aboard the Royal Africa Company slave ship Princess that fate would intervene in his life. On a hot June day in 1719, as the Princess was anchored off the Gold Coast trading station of Anambu, she was captured by the pirate ship Royal Rover under Captain Howell Davis. Davis was impressed by Roberts' navigational skills and press-ganged him aboard his crew. Later, Davis was killed in an attack on Principe, and the crew incredibly offered Roberts the captaincy. Though a pirate ship, Bartholomew Roberts could not turn down his dream of becoming captain of his own vessel. Roberts set to work imposing discipline on the unruly crew and creating an aura of authority around himself. In an effort to eliminate disorder, Roberts drew up new articles for the crew to sign and swear to abide. Bartholomew Roberts' pirate code contained articles electing the ship's captain, the division of treasure shares among the crew, and the distribution of justice aboard the vessel. Any man who dared challenge Roberts' authority or his strict pirate code was challenged to a duel. His explosive temper was often enough to cow his crew, and in his early captaincy he even shot some of his men in rage when they offended him. Roberts held fatalistic views. Believing in both God and the devil, He felt that as a pirate captain he had committed unforgivable sins which forfeited his place in heaven. With this mindset of his inevitable damnation, Roberts seemed touched with a madness which transformed him into a terrifying presence as he sailed the high seas seeking vengeance on the world and destruction for himself. But despite his fearsome and violent reputation, he was also highly respected by the crew for his seafaring skills and boldness in battle. Tall and slim, Black Bart loved wearing fine, gentlemanly clothing, which would become his trademark appearance. Once Black Bart had firmly established his authority as a pirate captain, he sailed west to the coast of Portuguese Brazil, covering 2,300 miles in just 28 days. After cruising the Brazilian coast for 9 weeks without spotting any prey, Roberts came across a Portuguese treasure fleet of 42 merchant ships off of Bahia, laden with gold, sugar, tobacco, wood, guns, and animal hides, which were forming into a convoy bound for Lisbon. Without hesitation, Roberts loosed all sails and bore down on the largest ship while hoisting a Portuguese flag to enter the formation. Roberts came alongside his target. A ship carrying 40 guns and a crew of 170 boarded her. The pirates swung onto the deck and overcame the crew's token resistance, then plundered the vessel of all of its valuable cargo in a quick manner and sailed out to sea before Portuguese escort warships could even weigh anchor from port. Among their loot were gold coins worth about £50,000. Throughout 1720, Roberts operated in the West Indies and off the North American coast. In July, he captured 10 French ships, commandeering one and fitting her with 26 guns, then renaming her Good Fortune, which he later renamed again as Royal Fortune. With the Royal Fortune, he wreaked havoc on mercantile shipping in the Caribbean. Roberts even captured the governor of Martinique as he was sailing on a 52-gun French warship, taking them by surprise and capturing her in a swift action. Roberts then hung the captive French governor off the Royal Fortune's yardarm. By the spring of 1721, Roberts had returned to West Africa, raiding French and Portuguese trading posts on the Gold Coast and along the Senegal River. He captured a large frigate at Point Cestos named the Onslow, and Black Bart transferred his flag to the ship, which became the 4th vessel he renamed Royal Fortune. Roberts and his 11 pirate ships terrorized the West African coast over the following months. But early the next year, Black Bart's pirating career would reach its dramatic end at the Battle of Cape Lopez. On February the 5th, 1722, the Royal Navy's 50-gun 4th-rate ship of the line HMS Swallow, commanded by Captain Challoner Ogle, arrived off Cape Lopez to search the swamps and inlets for the most infamous pirate of the age. While Ogle's warship sailed through the swamps, someone in Roberts' fleet fired a gun. Ogle directed his ship in the direction of the sound and spotted the Royal Fortune through his spyglass, escorted by the ship's Great Ranger and Little Ranger. Roberts now ordered Great Ranger to capture the Swallow, under the mistaken belief she was a merchant ship. Ogle sailed back into open waters, intent on luring Great Ranger out of the marsh. Following a long chase, Ogle allowed Great Ranger to close the distance, and the pirate vessel's captain, James Skyum, readied his crew for action. Suddenly, Swallow turned to starboard and fired a deadly broadside. The stunned pirates continued closing to board, firing their broadsides as they neared, but Ogle's disciplined sailors kept up a rapid cannon and small arms fire as the two pounded each other in open waters. By 3 p.m., the Great Ranger was so badly damaged that the badly wounded Skyum struck his colours. As the Swallow's surgeon tended to the Great Ranger's 20 wounded crewmen, the other 100 unharmed pirates were led into the Swallow's hold as prisoners. The Great Ranger was then sent to Principe Island, while Ogle's crew spent the next few days repairing damage before setting out again for Cape Lopez. She arrived off the inlet in the morning of February 10th. Roberts, still anchored within, appeared unconcerned that the Great Ranger had not returned. He seemed further unconcerned about reports that unfamiliar sails were spotted on the horizon. Finally, one of the pirates, a Royal Navy deserter who had once served on the Swallow, recognized her and identified the oncoming warship. Roberts was on deck in an instant, calmly ordering his men to arm themselves and take up battle stations. He then ordered the Little Ranger's crew to join his ship's company. At 10:30 a.m., Royal Fortune slipped away from her anchorage and set full sail to try and escape with the wind. Black Bart went to his cabin and dressed in his finest clothes. He then returned on deck and inexplicably ordered them to steer towards the Swallow rather than escape. The two vessels came within range at 11 a.m., and Roberts rushed from the quarterdeck to direct a gun on the railing. The Royal Fortune and HMS Swallow both delivered full broadsides almost simultaneously. Royal Fortune's mizzen topmast sail crashed onto the deck. With the thick cannon smoke clearing, the Royal Fortune's crew noticed Black Bart slumping over one of the guns. The helmsman went to his aid and discovered that their captain was dead. A blast of grape shot from one of the Swallow's guns had torn away his throat. The helmsman and many other crewmen openly wept at the sight of their fallen captain. With Robert's death, the leaderless crew of the Royal Fortune, there had never been a second in command, tried to escape into the open sea. It was a valiant effort, but the Swallow soon gained on the crippled vessel. The pirates made no effort to resist. Instead, they drank as the Swallow neared. At 2 p.m., 3 hours after Roberts was killed, the drunken crew of the Royal Fortune surrendered, and a boarding party climbed on deck to take them prisoner. With 254 prisoners now below deck, Captain Ogle set sail to Cape Coast Castle, where Black Bart's crew would be held in chains within underground slave dungeons beneath the castle, until they could be put on trial for piracy. Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts had died at the age of 39. In a pirating career not quite spanning 3 years, he had captured over 400 ships and made a terrifying name for himself from the shores of Newfoundland to Brazil and the Gold Coast of Africa. Roberts' death at the Battle of Cape Lopez on February 10, 1722, together with the hangings of Charles Vane and Calico Jack Rackham, marked the end of some of the post-Spanish succession period's last remaining notorious pirate figures. Though other pirates would try to hold out for years to come, prowling the coast of West Africa and the Indian Ocean around Madagascar, pirates had ceased being a serious threat to the maritime powers and their overseas commercial trade. The execution of the English pirate William Fly in Boston on July 12, 1726, is typically marked by historians as signalling the end of the Golden Age of Piracy in areas like the West Indies and Madagascar, though a few pirates would hold out into the 1730s. Although the post-Spanish succession pirates' reign of terror on the high seas was brief, their legacy would endure through the centuries, and pirates such as Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, Charles Vane, Jack Rackham, and Anne Bonny would remain strong household names associated with an era that has become both legendary and romanticized over the past 3 centuries. More videos on the most infamous outlaws of history are on the way, so make sure you're subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 300 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.